Hi, I'm Mara Webster within Creative Company, and I'm so excited today to be talking about HBO Max's Peacemaker. We are joined by some incredible artisans from behind the scenes who really made the visual offering that this show has become. We are joined today by Betsy Paterson, who is the VFX supervisor, along with Guy Williams, who's the VFX supervisor from Weta FX, Shay Cunliffe, who is the costume designer for the series, Lisa Soper, who's the production designer, Charissa-Lee Barton, who is the opening titles choreographer, and Wayne Dalglish, who is the stunt coordinator for the show. And Betsy and Guy, I wanted to start with a question for the two of you, because the visual effects in this show are so incredibly intricately detailed in so many ways. But one of the things that I love about visual effects as well is there's moments where it's invisible to the naked eye, and we don't necessarily know as an audience that there's so much of your work going into a moment that we're looking at. And in that collaboration and working with James Gunn and having early conversations about, you know, where effects were going to be really important to telling the story, where you're creating elements that wouldn't exist without effects, what that also looked like in terms for both of you of finding the places where visual effects was going to be a really key component for scenes where maybe, you know, it wouldn't be as noticeable, but would really enhance a particular moment. So I was interested in what those more invisible elements of visual effects were from both of you.
Well, there were quite a few, really. I mean, the show was originally pitched to me as not really a lot of visual effects. The producers and James kind of said, well, you know, it's not as big as shows you usually do. And, you know, of course, it turned out to be even bigger than a lot of shows that I've done. But yeah, we did have a lot of invisible effects. A lot of it was working with Wayne and Lisa to kind of find those places where, you know, something is really 90% practical, but just to push it much over the edge, there would be transition into visual effects. So yeah, the three of us actually worked quite closely together, figuring some of those things out.
I love that. And for you, Guy, what were some of those spaces or moments on the Weta side?
For us, it was kind of a little bit the opposite side of the story. We ended up doing things that, I mean, hopefully people don't know that Eagly is not a real eagle, but you know, we did a lot of the work on Eagly. I don't think anybody is going to think that the caterpillar cow was an invisible effect. It's, you know, so a lot of our work, unfortunately, in this regard, was kind of obvious.
We'll come back to talking about Eagly a little bit later, because I want to make sure that we get to dive into that amazing effect. And coming over to you, Shay, in terms of the costumes, it's such an interesting approach, because obviously you have Peacemaker, who's an established character within the franchise, but then you're also building so many other characters and costumes from the ground up. And so I was interested in kind of like both how the Peacemaker costume really influenced the creation of a lot of other costumes, but also as you were going through that initial design stage and creating those initial sketches, you know, it's such a discovery process as well, of like looking at different potential designs, different fabrics, different colors, different silhouettes. What were some of the spaces where you kind of really continued to evolve and finesse certain details in some of the costumes and found something a little bit different from where you'd started?
This was an interesting experience for me, both in terms of inheriting the great Peacemaker costume from Judianna Makovsky's work. But I started with only 2 months to prep the series. And they had already spoken to the wonderful film illusions, Russ Schinkel, who makes many fabulous superhero costumes. They'd already spoken to him a month before I met with them about concept ideas, because they realized that it should have been started yesterday. It was already late in getting going. So when I started the job, I inherited the first chapter had been done by Film Illusions with their in-house illustrators. And that was actually great and very helpful. I didn't resent it at all, because I could never have gotten it done in that time framework. And it just allowed me to sort of step in as with just a design eye and tweak what they had already begun. They had some very preliminary meetings about the direction. So the road was already laid. And I just sort of tweaked the design elements, the colors of some of the things. And it was great. It was a true collaboration on every level. I found that even by the time I started, Lisa had already done a ton of research, and I was just like, I'm just going to jump on your coattails here myself. I always appreciate it being teamwork. In my opinion, the whole thing is good teamwork, every project. But in this instance, I really had a costume team that were more significant than usual on a project. So I don't want to grab all the credit for those costumes. I think Russ Schinkel and Film Illusions brought something incredible to the table by the time I jumped in. And for the everyday costumes, that was just an interesting balance, because James discussed the project to me in terms of magical realism, of a very everyday world, very everyday people, and then these strange, magically realistic characters who've got an inflated conception of themselves. And it was how to do the ordinary and the extraordinary was actually the design challenge for me, and not have it be totally boring, but boring enough that you understood where we've got reality, we're blending it so that they don't stand out in a weird way. So I think Lisa probably had an aspect of that dilemma too, with some things were way out there, other things had to be grounded in Northwest small town America. So to me, that was an interesting part of it all.
Absolutely. And, to that point, Lisa, with Shay's description of having to balance the extraordinary and the ordinary, that's so much the case with a lot of the production design that we see in the show. And you're creating spaces that are very pristine and very high end, but then there's also spaces where you're really distressing what you're doing. You're maybe not putting that second coat of paint on. I've heard stories about, hitting things with hammers after you've built them, throwing coffee on walls. What were some of the areas where you actually almost wanted to kind of not create those final touches or distress something a little bit?
Where I did not want to do that?
Where you wanted to kind of distress it, or just kind of not have it as pristine?
Oh God, everything. The set that drove me crazy the most was actually the hotel that they stayed at. Because in my mind, it was, it's that gross carpet, it's the wood panel wall, it's all of those wonderful, horrible hotel rooms or motel rooms, extended stays that we've seen in every film that we all love, because they have all this character. And James says, no, it's not real. And he said, I want to suck your soul out. And I was like, no, why would you do this? And I didn't get it at first. And, he talked about bowls of balls, which I despise more than anything, because it's just, why would someone put a bowl of balls on their table? Makes no sense. But we had that, vases of sticks and beige taupe colors and nondescript artwork that has no feeling in it whatsoever. And I remember when we finished it, I looked at it and it felt very real. Eerily so. And, we turned in 2 sets at the same time that day. One was the quantum unfolding storage chamber, and one was the hotel. And the difference of reaction between the 2 spaces was probably the opposite of what I expected until I got it. And that's when I fell in love with it again. So that was one where I thought, at first I wanted to go really heavy with everything, with this texture and all the same way that we're doing with so many other set pieces. But what's beautiful is that there's this juxtaposition that's set up. There's a reality, there's a grounded nature. You believe that these characters could stay in these hotels because we've all been in them, and they are real. Most people nowadays haven't actually been in the ones that are depicted in film as those anymore. And I think that's the type of attention to detail and a really good example. I know it's not as exciting as some of the other set pieces that we've done, but for me, it very much is, because it's that moment where you realize you can make something feel more real than the unreal story we're trying to tell.
Yeah, I mean, I love those sorts of elements throughout all the different facets of the show, because that's what really makes it connect and work, like you were just saying. And Charissa, coming over to talking about the choreography of the opening title sequence, obviously, people absolutely fell in love with it, really connected to it. It's such a great introduction to character. And I was interested in the initial kind of conceptualization of how you wanted to choreograph that, because when you step back, it's kind of rooted in very modern dance moves, but there's kind of different styles to that, even including doing, you know, an homage to old silent cinema as an era. And so I was really interested in how you kind of came up with the idea of what you wanted the main stylistic approach of the choreography to be, but also the different influences and styles that you wanted to bring into that.
Yeah, you know, I'll echo what has been said a couple of times already, which is the groundedness in this insane world was something that was a really important part of everything that I did. I wanted to make sure that whatever movement it was, it felt really as natural and as grounded as possible. But it really was a process. I had, you know, various different influences that I knew I wanted to draw from. But when it really began to click for me as I was generating material in the living room that I'm sitting in right now, and set up a camera in front of myself just to you know, to improv for an hour or two and then pull the things that I liked. When it started to click is when I started to feel that the movement really resonated in the context of the show and of the scripts which I had read, that it really resonated with the music, with the song. And I'm very tuned into the musicality of a song, of a piece. And so I really wanted to make sure also that there were choreographic layers within the musicality of it. And so it began to click when I felt it kind of in my own body. And then from there had to determine what might have been too much for actors who aren't trained dancers, and when it was enough to be a challenge. Because I also, somewhat similar to what Shay was saying, I didn't want it to be boring, meaning I didn't want the movement to be too simple, too easy, but it also had to be attainable. So I had to keep all of those things in mind, and the complexity comes with some of the musicality and some of the trickiness, and some of the coordination is quite tricky. But it was a process over a few weeks, actually, of exploring different movements, and then a lot of the transitions and the movement itself evolved in the HQ space. So I started staging it, choreographing and staging it in the headquarters, and Lisa had such a clear, the design of the headquarters was just it was so rich, and there was so much there to tune into, that it allowed me to get inside of the material in a way that I don't think I would have had the same access had we have just started on the stage, which is a completely different, you know, neon, shiny, bright, clean, all of that. So working in HQ with the movement and finding a lot of detail there really, like I said, allowed me to get inside of the physically inside of the show in a way that I might not otherwise have had access to. So there were a lot of different things, but speaking on the movement and the choreography specifically, there were so many different influences, but ultimately came down to what just felt right in my own body, and then began to look right on the actors and the dancers that I brought in to stand in for them.
I love that. And especially that idea of creating something that's challenging but attainable, which brings me over to you, Wayne, in terms of all the stunt work on the show, because in working with all of the cast and working with the rest of your stunt team, obviously all of the cast come to the show with different levels of expertise and experience in terms of working within stunts. And so I'm always really fascinated by that aspect of, you know, working with each actor individually, you know, to figure out what the movement of their character is going to be, you know, how would this particular character move in a way that maybe this character wouldn't, but also taking into account, you know, what each actor's experience was that they were bringing to the table. And so what did that collaboration with the cast look like for you?
Well, it started with James and identifying what it is that he wanted for each character. And we got pretty lucky with our cast on this particular show, because everyone was very physical and everyone was like super willing to train and be there and show up and put in the work. So it always makes our job much easier when they're down to do that. So I don't know, it was a pleasure overall. And yeah, like we always follow James's lead. I had a very good fight coordinator and choreographer who's lives in Vancouver right now, Alex Kiskovich. And he, I don't know, like the whole stunt team, we would all like basically throw in our ideas and send reference passes to James, and then we talk about it, and then we kind of like dial it in from there. And James was really good about giving us like reference movement to watch, specific like films that he wanted us to follow. So I don't know, it was nice having like a lot of very specific direction from him. So I don't know, it was cool.
Yeah. No, I really love that. What were some of the specific films or references that he was sharing with you that were kind of like inspirational in terms of figuring out what some of the movement or styles for scenes of the show were going to be?
There was some Korean films he had me watch when I first signed on to the show. And just to like, I don't know, take as inspiration, and then we would basically shoot previzes for him. And then from there, yeah, I don't know. That's basically how we did it.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I love those details. And coming back to you, Guy, because obviously you were bringing up one of everybody's favorite characters, Eagly, in the show, and I loved that behind the scenes VFX video that James posted on social media and kind of shared, that showed a lot of what went into creating some of the facets. And with Eagly, you really get to see that it really does start with, you know, building the visual effect of the skeleton, building it layer by layer, texture by texture. And so I was just really interested in what that looked like behind the scenes, both when you were creating Eagly as a character and creating each of those layers and textures, and then from there finding the movement of Eagly as a character for the show so that the audience could really be drawn in and connect to it.
No, totally. There's been some fantastic points brought up. Like one of the something that Lisa said that resonates really well with me is just that, you know, James is, when he's making these kind of movies, he's coming up with this beautiful sort of dichotomy of contrasting ideas all the time. Like, you know, he constantly is telling us that Eagly has to be this rich character, this interesting character, and you know that he's going to be a co-star in the film even. But at the same time, he's like, but it has to be a real bird, has to be a real bird, has to be a real bird. You know, so it's finding. Yeah, there's two challenges. One is just making a real feathered eagle, which is not the easiest thing technologically, but the other is trying to mine that character and come up with you know how you're going to portray an eagle, but only use the expression set that's provided by a real bird. So you know, there's a lot of back and forth trying to figure out. You know, there's times where we blurred the lines just a little bit. We would find something close enough that an eagle could do so that it looked kind of right, but you know, it might be based off of what a dog would do. But you know, of course, I'm speaking of the scene where Eagly has his head out the window as he's panting as the car is driving along the road. But you know, it's the kind of thing that when you get right, you empathize with the character more because you believe it and you believe in it, but at the same time, it's telling an interesting story. Technologically, it's just yeah, feathers. We've been doing them for a long time in the industry. The first bird I ever did was Gwahir on Lord of the Rings 1. But you know, the technology has come a long way since then. Back then, we did the feathers as sort of painted shingles on the character. Now we model all the, not just the feathers, but the hairs coming off the feathers that create the feather, and then the hairs coming off the hairs, and then the hairs coming off the hairs that come off the hairs. So like the amount of detail we go into is pretty complex, but the thing that makes a bird so challenging is that all the feathers have to stay kind of smooth to the surface. And if you don't get it right, then it just doesn't look like a real bird. Even when you get it right, you run into little problems like the fact that, you know, we got to the point where Eagly was starting to look like a real bird, but somebody at one point in a screening room, and Betsy probably can answer where this occurred, but somebody said, it looks a little bit like a seagull. And at that point, you're like, oh, that's so not the character we're going for. So, once it was said, we all could see it. It's one of those things, you point out something and everybody in the room is just like, oh God, it's a seagull. So, we found, you start mining the references of a real eagle. You start trying to figure out what separates an eagle from a seagull. It's not just that it has brown feathers versus white feathers. But what we came up with was that, Eagly, it's almost like the eagle character from the Muppet Show. He's always got this kind of, self-assured, confident, overly, almost kind of aggressive stance to himself all the time. And we started bringing that into the design of the character, but also into the animation of the character. That helped us at least get rid of the seagull part of it.
That's amazing. And Betsy, to that point that Guy was just making about obviously how far VFX technology has come over recent years. From your perspective, what were some of the things that you feel like you were able to achieve on this series that maybe even like 2, 3, 5 years ago, just technology wise, wouldn't have been possible to do at all, or just in the way that you did them?
I think it's in general, not so much that we were doing things that weren't possible, but I think we were doing them with a little bit more ease that could exist on a television schedule. I think that's kind of a new thing in the last couple of years, is you can do feature level effects, and Guy will attest. We paid these shots the same amount of attention you would if it was in the biggest budget feature that James usually does. But because it is a little bit easier to work with this stuff now, and it's, we've got big render farms and many talented artists with 20 years experience to their belt. You can pull it off in a way that you just wouldn't really attempt to do for television. I think if 5, 6 years ago, you probably wouldn't try to have a full CG character be one of your leads in the show. But now you can do it. It's still a lot of work, and it's really the guys that work with Guy really pulled off some amazing stuff. Some of the animation, just to this day, is just my favorite things that we've ever worked on.
Yeah, no, it's really incredible, the intricacy of it. And Charissa and Lisa, Charissa, you were talking earlier about the opening sequence and how it was originally set to be filmed in HQ, and then James had the idea of moving it over into more of a stage space. And with both of your involvements in that sequence, I was interested in what that looked like in those few days that you had to pull it over, because Lisa, I know for you and your team, that was a case of completely redesigning from scratch, thinking about the different potential visual aesthetics, putting together a lot of sketches for James, and Charissa, that's you kind of taking the idea of the choreography that you created for a very specific space and thinking about, the way that movement's going to potentially fit, live and breathe in a completely different environment, with a different aesthetic. And so what were some of the elements that were always there from the beginning? And then what were some of the shifts and changes that happened within the opening title sequence from that changeover to a stage?
Well, the song was the same, and the cast that was the same.
Thank God.
I think Chris will talk more about the movements and everything like that. I don't want to speak for her on that, but it was kind of amazing. Like, it really was. I'll be honest, and when I originally read it, as much as I love the HQ, there was part of me that was like, oh no, this isn't, it wants to be a big music number with everybody together. But, we went with it, and we did what we did. So I'd like to say I was surprised when I got the phone call. It was more so, oh yeah, it's how many days away? Okay, shit, let's go. And it was, the inspiration was very much just that kooky, wacky sensibility that James has, and trying to, draw overnight. I think it was somewhere around 20 some odd concepts that came out between 20 odd concepts or so that came out between the end of the day and I think 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning when we sent out the samples. And I think that one that we see, it was actually the last one that I did, and I threw it in as a bogey, because everything else was trying to follow a certain type of a narrative. Like, there's one where there were these like nukes mounted on the back of Lamborghinis. There was another one, like with big trucks and tanks. There was wolves howling at 2 moons with lightning bolts that came into the set. Like, anything you could possibly imagine with this character for an opening title credit sequence. it was there. And it was so much fun though, like sitting there listening to the song and thinking of like, what about this? What about this? What about this? There were no limitations. And that last one was something where I felt like I was missing something else. So because there was almost like a theme tonality that really fit, everything else fit together, even though, you know, one had Wolves Howling at the Moon and one had Lamborghinis with nukes. There was still this kind of thing that I wanted to tap into that felt very, very different. And I just put the song on and kind of just closed my eyes. And what I saw was, you know, these flashes of every 80s hair metal album cover that, you know, I grew up with. And it was the colors and the geometric lines and that kind of thing. And I just went, you know what, I'm going to do this. Let's, you know, maybe he'll like it, maybe he won't. And he said, that's the one, which was the hardest one to build, by the way, because it was all mirror work. So thank you, visual effects team for,
Yeah.
we actually didn't have to clean up that much. Most of it worked. There was very little cleanup.
We were hopeful. Yeah. We were really hopeful because I was like, if we dirty the mirrors just enough and we angle them like this, hopefully this will work. And yeah. And then you know, here's what I will say about it though. We had such little amount of time, like, and you'll hear this so much when anyone talks to us about Peacemaker. There wasn't a lot of time, you know, compared to doing a large feature, but it still had the same appetite. It still had the same amazing story. It still had the same amazing people. So to take all of these professionals and put them into a television timeline and still be able to have something that doesn't get compromised at all is incredible. And to see how everyone worked together, you know, every department that came in and was so calm and understanding. And it was like, okay, the paint is literally drying right now. Can we just move over here? Okay, we can get the camera equipment in and we get the lighting equipment over here. And it was a dance actually behind the scenes of the dance to try to get everything together.
It truly was. Yeah, it was amazing to watch everyone pull together and like you said, very calmly do what needed to be done. It was stressful. it was in terms for me. I think one of the first questions that I asked was, is this material going to work on? I know I can make. I performed on stages for over 20 years. I know stages very well, but does the quality of the movement and the material that I created in HQ on this stage and with this design, will it work? And I ultimately had to very quickly embrace it. And it was actually pretty easy to do so because I thought the contrast here is really cool. I think it'll resonate and work really well. This kind of grungy, grounded, crazy movement, funny movement on the stage, which I loved. I'm so happy that that's the one that James selected and that you came up with, Lisa, because it reminded me of my old Solid Gold. I was a huge Solid Gold fan, and it just took me right back to that time. And so when the decision was made to change to a stage, it happened to be on the same day that was my first rehearsal with the actors. So the 2 weeks that led up to the shoot, when the stage was being built, happened to be the time that my schedule was fully booked, teaching the actors material that was done. And I knew that I couldn't teach them material and then change it on them, because for non-dancers, for people who aren't trained dancers and learning choreography on a regular basis, once you learn something and get it into your muscle memory and get it into your body and feeling good in your body, you don't want to change it. It's very hard to change. And so I didn't want to throw any last minute stuff at them, but it was very challenging to hold on to as much material as possible. But also I wound up having to change about half of it. So I'd work with the actors during the day and then go home at night and do my best to I worked with my husband. I would, wake him up at all hours and get him to do some stuff for me. And I didn't have full access to the stage until 2 days before the shoot. And then even then it was still being built. So a lot of the transitions and the staging itself had to be done real fast. Once I got access to the stage, it was just making quick choices. And I had done a lot of the work, and it was as prepared as I possibly could be, and very thorough up until that point. And thank God for that, because it really was, there was very, very little time to pull it together with the change. But it came together. It worked out really well. And a lot of that had to do with like everyone, like you said, everyone pulling together and getting the job done as best as possible. And working with Stunts actually to help with popping out of the hole in the floor, and a couple of other things. Slide, you would think that sliding across a stage, like when Peacemaker comes out halfway through, slides on is easy. It's not. It's actually really tricky. You need to make the floor slippery, but not too slippery. You have to be able to stop. So it's very, very tricky. Anyway, the Stunts team really helped with details like that. So it was a true team effort.
I mean, it really, really came together. And speaking of Stunts again, Wayne, there's so many really great sequences throughout the show, and so many great uses of space where you're really using every corner of a location. And the one scene that I wanted to ask you about is the moment where you have Peacemaker fighting in his tighty whities, because I thought that was such a great scene. You've really used every single space to the point where you have him going out of the window. And I was just interested in what that looked like, and coming up with that, and working closely with Spencer Thomas, who's John's stunt double, working with John himself to really configure and choreograph a scene like that, which is so intricate and has so many motions to it.
I guess what we started with is, after James kind of talked about the sequence, all the story moments that happened within the fight came out of James' brain. Like, it's even written in the script that he's like grabbing things off of shelves and like throwing things. So there was like a nice blueprint to follow. And then we actually choreographed that scene in California before we went up to Vancouver. And it was kind of like hey, check this out. Like, this is a cool vibe of something that we think that you're hopefully something that you're looking for. So we do like Stunt Previz. Like, that's where we basically film it on like in a stunt facility or warehouse, and get wire gags and a stunt team like Spencer, and then someone to play the rocker chick in like a box environment that we build. And then we I think I called Lisa, or Lisa called me, and then we talked, like, she'd send me blueprints and things like that of what the room actually looks like. She'd give me dimensions and information, so then we can kind of replicate that in our facility using boxes on like a spring floor. So then we can do like multiple takes, try different angles, and kind of like R&D and concept the scene beforehand. And one thing I want to note about that, which is like really interesting, is James already has a lot of his like music choices picked out beforehand. And it was a very like strange but like fun song. Is a choir boy song that's like really slow, and like to like have that going, like, so like we would turn on the music like when we're actually like shooting and doing the fight, and it, I don't know, it kind of like brought life to it right away, and we're like, oh my god, this is like something to latch onto. So but I don't remember what your question was. I'm sorry.
No, you absolutely answered it, and gave so many great details. I appreciate it. And then, Shay, similar to how with production design, there's kind of elements and details that you wanted to stress a little bit. That also feels like that's part of the trajectory for some of the costumes, particularly Peacemakers. And I was interested in how you worked with costumes continuing throughout the series after you created them or built them, and then looked at what is the journey this character is going through, and as a result, what's the journey this costume needs to go to really reflect that. Even down to the fact that with Peacemaker, there's multiple versions of that costume throughout the entire series that you built, constructed, and what are some of the kind of ways and tactics and methods that you would use to slightly distress or muddy up some of those costumes in that way a little bit?
Well, that actually was the lion's share of the work for the costume department, was all the action and blood and gore that was going to happen, and burns and gashes. And each character had a different materials in their costume and different reasons that they got so damaged. Everyone had a lot of multiples. Peacemaker alone was in a unique situation that his costume was being fabricated for him in the magic quantum closet. And so we knew we can explain why he isn't going to have to spend all 8 episodes in that exact costume. So we would we'd decide the moment that it's too far gone and we'll start again. I had an amazing team of craftspeople and ages on this show. Without them, I don't think we could have done the very plausible and excellent work that we did in that department. It was an exhausting process of constantly showing James how far we'd gone and was it enough. It was just tons of text messages like, here's where we're at. Are we there yet? No, you're not quite there yet. James is extremely responsive and helpful, I found, throughout the process in every way of answering questions very concisely and very clear what we had to do. So it was literally just the work in our studio of going for it. It was scary sometimes because these costumes are extremely time consuming and expensive to make. And so it's like, oh no, I can't look. You're going to have to like destroy this and smash it, but I'm going to come back in 20 minutes. I can't stand to see this. They were luckily very confident, my team. And so they're like, don't worry, we got this. With something like Vigilante, who did not have multiple, I mean, he did have multiples because we had stunt people and a progress, but his character only had the one self costume that we felt he had put together himself. So that was a great relief, because if we'd gone too far, we just patched it up ourselves as if we were Vigilante, as crude as possible. And then the White Dragon, the main challenge with him is knowing, well, actually, this was a different challenge, which is he's going to be dressed into his superhero costume. You usually start and the character is all put together, and it was kind of great to vest him like the king by his acolytes. But that was figuring out and sharing with everyone what you can do with this, what are the phases of it. But I just want to, going back to the music and how important it was, one of the great things I think for all of us working on it is that James provided a playlist that he shared with every new script we got, which was a new experience for me and was incredibly helpful to be playing it and knowing exactly everything as he was perceiving, thinking it, as we prepped it at the same time. And just to revisit the opening credit sequence, because I think it was unbelievable that Lisa was suddenly redesigning it. I think it was like 2 days before we shot it. We were all reeling, and luckily Lisa always kept me in the loop. So it was like, tell me, give me anything of where we're going on this. And I, for a moment, thought, oh gosh, I'm going to have to redesign everything, because the mandate had been make them very everyday. I mean, different clothes, except for the superhero costumes, different clothes that we don't use in the actual project, but same spirit of clothes. But then I'm like, oh my God, but it's going to be this glitzy, glammy set now with lights and pink and purple everywhere. Surely I need to do a whole other level of dance costumes now. And I immediately am going to James, like, do you want something completely different? And he was like, no, still the same, which it was really frightening to me. But then I realized this was his genius in putting this whole project together. It was exactly the same every day and magical. And that set and the characters in it, in the dance sequence, sort of epitomizes that for me. I
had fun working with you, Shay, on some of the costume stuff with the opening sequence, like finding moments to add little elements, like when Chukwudi opens his jacket toward the end, it was just a flash of color, and then some other, are they going to be able to lift their arms in these
Oh.
costumes? And like details, you know, there were details like that, but it was the colors and some of that stuff that was really fun to
yes.
explore.
When I saw Lisa Set rendition, that made me think I've got to lift it a little bit. Okay, we're going to still keep them in themselves, they're ordinary characters, but wherever I can inject. I think Adebayo's girlfriend Elizabeth is very symptomatic. I thought I can get away with something a little bit more out there in her clothes, but it was a bit of a tightrope to get to that place. And the only character I tried to do more and it didn't quite fly was oh gosh, I am forgetting her character name now, but Jen Holland. I made a series of cat suits that were more wow. I think I'd watched the early music video of that song a lot, and I felt, can't I interject a little bit of what was going on in that too? So she was in like a leather cat suit, and I made another one that had like stripes up it, and it came down, then I got the message like, no, we really want to keep her simple like she's been in the series. So that was the one thing where I tried to like have one character a bit more wow, and pulled it back down. But I actually think it was perfect. I think it came together in a way I hadn't fully understood as we were putting it together.
It's so fascinating. I mean, I'm so in awe of all of the incredible details that you've all brought to this series. It's really remarkable, and you've done such a great job at making everything that's so extraordinary about the show feel very grounded in the way that you've approached it. So thank you so much for taking time and talking all about it. Really, really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. It's a pleasure.